The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim light of a candle, imagine the air thick with the scent of wax, parchment, and faint decay. The silence of an old archive broken only by the turning of a single page. Within its fibers lie stories that were never meant to be told aloud. The cries of women who gave life in a time when life itself was uncertain. These are the records of childbirth in the Middle Ages, when every birth was a wager between heaven and earth, and every mother's breath could be her last. In the Europe of the 13th and 14th centuries, childbirth was not an act of joy but an ordeal of endurance. Society saw it less as a moment of creation than as a divine trial. No physician stood by to measure pulse or temperature. No anesthesia dulled the agony. The only instruments were faith, endurance, and the trembling hands of other women who had faced the same abyss before. Pain was not an error of nature. It was doctrine. It was Eve's burden, handed down through generations. The Church's words echoed through every chamber where a woman labored. "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." It was not a comfort, but a decree. To understand this world, one must first understand how religion governed the body. The human body was seen not as a vessel of independence, but as an instrument of divine justice. Every vein, every wound, every birth was subject to moral scrutiny. To ease pain was to question God's will. Priests and theologians argued that childbirth pain cleansed the soul, redeeming the sin of womanhood itself. And so, for centuries, midwives were forbidden from using herbs or practices that might dull the suffering. Some defied this order in secrecy, whispering prayers over herbs like belladonna and mandrake, but their work always teetered between healing and heresy. Yet within this dark theology, communities formed their own systems of care, fragile, feminine networks that survived in the shadows of the church. The midwife, often an older woman with no formal training, stood at the center of this world. She was at once healer, confidant, and priestess. Her knowledge was inherited orally, through whispered instructions and blood-stained experience. In her hands lay a strange power, the ability to guide life into the world, or to fail and be condemned for it. Records from across England, France, and the Germanic lands speak of the same dimly lit rooms. Narrow, smoky spaces where the walls seemed to sweat with fear. Women gathered not to celebrate, but to witness. The expectant mother, pale and trembling, was placed on a low stool or a straw-covered bed. Candles burned beside relics and charms. A saint's bone, a lock of hair, a tiny wooden cross blackened by smoke. The room filled with murmured prayers, the rhythmic chanting of psalms, the smell of sage and lavender smoldering in clay bowls. Somewhere, perhaps in the corner, a midwife recited Latin phrases she did not fully understand. Charms passed down through generations, meant to open the womb or ward off evil spirits said to linger near birthing women. Outside, men waited in silence. Birth was not their realm. To them it was a mystery, both sacred and grotesque, something whispered of but rarely witnessed. A husband might pace outside the door, clutching a rosary, listening helplessly to the sounds of suffering, the groans that rose and fell like waves, the sudden silence that froze the heart. In those moments, every breath inside the chamber was a prayer for survival, for not all births ended in life. In some villages, 1 in every 10 mothers died in childbirth. Fever, hemorrhage, infection, words that had not yet found medical meaning, swept through homes like curses. The cause was unseen and therefore spiritual. Some said demons crept into the body during delivery. Others believed that witches cursed the womb, or that sin itself turned blood black. A woman who died in childbirth was often buried in haste, her child, if still inside her, baptized by a desperate ritual. Water would be poured through the mother's body, trickling through the birth canal, while a priest murmured blessings. If the child died unbaptized, its soul was thought to wander forever, unable to enter heaven. Such rites sound grotesque now, but to them they were acts of mercy, a final attempt to bargain with God. And those who performed them did so in fear, for the Church's hand was heavy upon the midwife. If too many mothers died under her care, she might be accused of witchcraft. If she used herbs that dulled pain, she might be summoned before a tribunal. If she whispered charms in the wrong tongue, it could be seen as blasphemy. She stood forever at the edge of light and darkness, needed yet distrusted. Still, these women persisted. They gathered herbs by moonlight, studied the bodies of animals to learn anatomy in secret, and risked excommunication to record what they knew. In convents, some nuns began keeping written accounts, not only of births, but of the patterns they observed, the herbs that worked, the prayers that failed. Their manuscripts, often unsigned and hidden within theological texts, became the earliest fragments of gynecological knowledge. Yet even then, their observations were treated as superstition, dismissed by male scholars who considered the female body a mystery best left to theology. To step back and look upon this world is to see a civilization both devout and terrified. Death was never far. The churchyard was an extension of every household. Yet in that fear grew rituals that bound communities together. The smell of rosemary burning in a birthing room was not merely superstition. It was an attempt to make sense of chaos, to assert some control over what could not be controlled. When a mother screamed, her cry echoed the cry of Eve, and in her endurance, she was believed to redeem not only herself, but all women. As centuries passed, whispers began to challenge that idea. In Italy and southern France, early physicians trained in the Arab medical tradition began to write about anatomy and pain. They observed that some women survived more easily when certain herbs were used, when cleanliness was kept, when hands were washed before touching the body. But even as knowledge expanded, it met resistance. Pain remained holy. Suffering remained proof of faith. To question it was to question the divine order. Yet beneath the sermons and prohibitions, a quiet revolution stirred. Not in universities or cathedrals, but in the homes of midwives and the diaries of women who refused to die quietly. Their words, though few survive, reveal a haunting resilience. They prayed, bled, screamed, and survived, leaving behind not monuments but bloodlines. The act of survival itself was their legacy. When a woman gave birth in medieval Europe, she did so surrounded by layers of belief, fear, and ritual. She bore the weight of theology, the scrutiny of community, and the shadow of mortality. And when the child's first cry finally broke through the darkness, it was not simply a birth, it was a resurrection. For every breath drawn by the newborn was bought with the mother's agony, her faith, her surrender. The chroniclers rarely wrote her name. In royal accounts, the mother's death might be noted as a footnote beside the heir's birth. In village records, she might be remembered only through gossip or prayer. Yet the echoes of her suffering shaped an entire civilization's understanding of life itself. It taught them that creation was inseparable from pain, that holiness demanded blood, and that every act of bringing forth life was a confrontation with death. And so, the story of medieval childbirth is not only a tale of pain, it is the anatomy of faith. Within it lies a truth that both horrifies and humbles, that long before medicine, before hospitals and sterile tools, women endured the darkness armed only with courage, belief, and the trembling hope that their suffering had meaning. As the candle burns low in this imagined archive, one might close the parchment and whisper a silent benediction for those forgotten mothers, whose cries, though unrecorded, still echo faintly in the rituals of modern birth. For even now, behind every sterile wall and surgical mask, there lingers the shadow of that ancient fear, the thin, eternal line between life and death that every mother once crossed in silence. The parchment continues, its surface brittle beneath the hand, edges curled as if the centuries themselves have tried to consume it. The ink grows darker now, the script steadier, the hand of someone who has seen too much but still believes the story must be told. The next passages speak not of kings or scholars, but of those nameless figures who stood beside the women in the most perilous hour of their lives. The midwives, the watchers between life and death. The medieval midwife was not born of rank or education. She was shaped by necessity and by the trust of other women. Her knowledge was inherited, not taught. No university would open its doors to her. No priest would sanctify her art. And yet, without her, half the world would never have been born. In the dim rooms of stone cottages and timbered halls, she was the first to arrive, and often the last to leave. She brought with her a leather satchel filled with things that seemed ordinary, but bordered on the mystical. Lengths of cloth, bits of wax, small jars of herbs, a rosary, a vial of holy water, and sometimes a charm bound in thread. To the eyes of the church, these objects hovered uneasily between medicine and witchcraft. To the women who labored, they were salvation. When labor began, a signal passed quietly through the village. A whispered word, a door opening in haste, footsteps in the dark. Women gathered. The midwife entered with calm authority, though she knew well that the room she stepped into might soon become a deathbed. She would anoint the doorway with oil, sprinkle holy water on the bed, and light candles for St. Margaret, protector of mothers and newborns. The room became a small sanctuary, separated from the rest of the world, sealed by prayer and fear. In that dim space, ritual was not superstition. It was structure, the only kind that could stand against chaos. The church had decreed that women should give birth in humility, without excess or distraction. But what priests condemned as vanity, the women reclaimed as protection. They surrounded the mother with symbols, crosses, relics, carved amulets, each representing a fragile thread between the human and the divine. Sometimes the midwife would tie a narrow belt around the woman's waist, embroidered with sacred words in Latin. The phrase, Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis, might be whispered as she tightened the knot, believing it would ease the passage of the child. Some belts were heirlooms, passed down from mother to daughter, their stitches faded but their faith intact. Others were improvised, torn from the cloth of a saint's robe or the hem of a bridal gown. Then came the herbs, the scents that filled the room like a prayer of smoke. Sage to cleanse, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for mercy. The air shimmered with their mingled fragrance. Some midwives burned the herbs in small fires, circling the mother's bed 3 times as they murmured invocations. The line between blessing and spell was thin. Every act was both medicine and magic. As the hours passed and pain deepened, the rhythm of the room changed. The prayers became louder, faster, almost desperate. Women wept and shouted the name of the Virgin Mary, calling upon her as both mother and witness. In the chaos of sound and blood, the midwife's voice remained low, steady, unwavering, the heartbeat of the ritual. She alone had the courage to touch what others feared, the trembling flesh, the blood that pooled beneath the body, the fragile thread of life slipping between her fingers. There was no anesthesia, no sterile instruments. Hands were washed in warm wine or vinegar, and knives were heated in fire before cutting the cord. Some midwives used sharp shells or shards of flint. The newborn's first cry was the sign of victory. Silence was a curse. When a child did not breathe, the midwife rubbed its body with ashes, breathed into its mouth, or whispered secret prayers, words she would never repeat outside that room. To speak them elsewhere, it was said, would anger the spirits that guarded birth. Every act carried meaning. When the infant was finally delivered, it was lifted toward the light, even if that light was only a flickering candle. The midwife traced the sign of the cross on its forehead with trembling fingers. The mother, pale and exhausted, was given a cup of wine infused with mint and honey. Outside, the village might already be gathering, waiting for news, for joy or mourning. But childbirth was rarely clean. The mother's body was torn, fevered, and weakened. Midwives knew the danger of infection, though they had no name for it. They spoke instead of the bad air, the heat of the womb, or the corruption of the blood. To drive it away, they applied poultices of honey, ashes, or animal fat. They burned certain herbs and recited psalms. And when these failed, as they often did, they prayed. In the written records that survive, one finds glimpses of these women not as witches, but as quiet heroines. In some towns, the midwife was required to swear an oath before the local priest that she would baptize a dying child, that she would not conceal a malformed infant, that she would not use forbidden charms. The oath was both an honor and a shackle. It acknowledged her power while keeping her under suspicion. And yet, in secret, many midwives held to older traditions. They knew of herbs passed down since pagan times, mugwort, valerian, foxglove. They marked lunar cycles and believed certain nights brought safer births. They spoke of guardian spirits, not to defy the church, but to survive where doctrine could not help them. For all the church's authority, it was the midwife who faced the bleeding and the screams, who risked her soul each time she tried to save another's body. Sometimes she failed, and when she did, the whispers began. A woman who lost too many patients might be summoned to court, accused of witchcraft or heresy. Some were burned, others banished. Their tools, the same instruments that had once delivered life, were displayed as evidence of evil. A knife, a vial of herbs, a string of beads could condemn her. Yet even under threat, the lineage of midwives endured. They carried their secrets from village to village, their names erased but their craft intact. There are fragments in old chronicles describing how, in times of plague or famine, midwives became the only remaining healers. They tended not only to births, but to the dying, their hands moving from cradle to grave in a single breath. In these moments, they blurred the boundaries of life itself. To touch the dying was to invite suspicion. To save them was to challenge divine judgment. But they continued, unseen, unthanked. Their art was not only about life. It was about control, in a world where women had almost none. Within the birthing chamber, power shifted. The priest waited outside, the husband prayed beyond the door. But inside, it was the midwife who commanded. Her words, her hands, her will guided the moment that defined every lineage, every inheritance. In a society ruled by men, birth was the one domain that remained unmistakably female, and so the birthing chamber became a paradoxical altar, both holy and forbidden. Blood was shed there as in any battlefield. Prayers were offered, sometimes answered, often not. Each birth renewed the fragile pact between flesh and spirit, between human courage and divine indifference. There are accounts, written in careful Latin, describing the birthing girdles used in late medieval England. These strips of parchment were inscribed with prayers, wrapped around the mother's body, and believed to protect her from mortal peril. Some were adorned with miniature paintings, angels, saints, scenes of the Virgin and Child, as if beauty itself might guard against pain. When labor ended, the girdle was folded and kept as a relic, stained with sweat and blood. To modern eyes, they are eerie artifacts. To those women, they were proof that faith could be worn like armor. In the rare event that the mother survived but the child did not, grief was muffled by ritual. The midwife might place a small wooden cross in the infant's hands, wrap it in linen, and whisper a blessing before burial. The child's soul, they believed, hovered near, waiting for its mother's prayers to carry it upward. In villages where superstition ran deep, tiny footprints were pressed into clay or ashes, a mark to remind the living that the child had touched the earth, however briefly. These customs were not recorded in royal chronicles or theological treatises, but they formed the emotional spine of medieval society. Each act, the prayer, the charm, the scent of burning herbs, was an attempt to tame the unknowable. They did not separate medicine from magic, because life itself did not offer that luxury. Pain and healing, body and soul, life and death, all were intertwined. By the 15th century, some change began to stir. In towns where literacy spread, a few midwives learned to read short medical texts translated from Arabic and Latin. They began to compare the old prayers with new anatomical ideas. A few daring women even wrote their own manuals, hidden beneath religious covers to avoid suspicion. These manuscripts spoke of things once unspeakable, of muscle, womb, blood, and breath. They were not yet science, but they were something close. Observation born of compassion. Still, for most of Europe, childbirth remained as it had always been, a matter of faith and endurance. A woman entered her chamber knowing she might never leave it. Yet she did so with courage passed down from generations of others who had faced the same terror. Behind every relic and every whispered prayer stood centuries of defiance, of women who refused to let fear or doctrine silence them. In the candlelight of those long nights, surrounded by smoke and cries, the midwife was both witness and guardian. She carried the weight of countless lives and deaths, her hands marked by the invisible ink of history. To her, every birth was a negotiation, not just with God, but with fate itself. And when dawn finally came, and the newborn's first wail broke the stillness, she would wash her hands in cold water, whisper a final blessing, and step into the morning light, exhausted, unsung, but victorious once more against the oldest enemy of all, death. The candle in the imagined archive burns lower now, its wick drowning slowly in wax. The next pages are darker, inked in a different hand. Perhaps a witness who lived among the midwives. Perhaps a scholar who could not ignore what faith forbade. The script trembles with a mixture of fascination and fear, describing the strange ways in which medieval women and their healers sought to ease the agony that God himself was said to have decreed. For though the Church insisted that pain was holy, the human body has always rebelled against suffering. In that rebellion grew a hidden art, one that mingled medicine, superstition, and desperate faith. Within the smoky chambers where women labored, potions simmered and charms whispered. Remedies born of folklore and fear passed from hand to hand. These were not miracles, but acts of defiance, small, trembling attempts to reclaim the body from divine punishment. The medieval world believed that pain had purpose, but pain could also kill. Midwives knew this well. A mother writhing too long might lose her strength, her breath, her will. So they sought ways to ease the torment, however dangerous. In old village notes and physicians' ledgers, one finds descriptions of mixtures so strange they seem almost alchemical. Rennet from calves' stomachs, powdered coral, ground pearls, and honey. Wine infused with rue, wormwood, and henbane. Some concoctions were harmless, comforting more by ritual than by chemistry. Others carried the promise of oblivion and death. Among the most notorious were brews containing belladonna, the deadly nightshade, whose roots and berries could still a body into sleep or silence it forever. Small doses dulled pain. Too much stopped the heart. Midwives handled it with reverence, measuring by intuition, by experience, by prayer. A drop for mercy, one anonymous note reads, and none more, lest the mother's soul depart before the child's. From the east came the opium poppy, traded through the Mediterranean in powders and syrups. It was mixed into wine, stirred with milk, and offered between contractions. To drink and forget, one chronicler wrote, was to risk damnation, and yet many did. Mandrake, too, was prized, a root shaped like a human body, said to scream when torn from the earth. Its cry was said to drive men mad, and yet its extract was used to dull agony, to quiet both mother and midwife alike. But not every village could afford such rare poisons. In the poorer hamlets, simpler charms prevailed. Women tied iron keys to their girdles, believing metal would draw out the devil causing the pain. Some bound their bellies with red ribbons, inscribed with Latin verses, invoking saints whose relics were miles away. "Open as Christ's tomb," they whispered. "Let the gate of life be unsealed." The very language of childbirth was theological. The womb became a chapel, the opening of the body a resurrection. There were stranger rituals still. In parts of Germany and Bohemia, when labor stalled, the husband might be ordered to unfasten every knot in the house, laces, ropes, belts, to symbolically loosen the body of his wife. Windows and doors were flung wide open, lest the soul be trapped within. Some midwives kept relics of childbirths past, bits of wax shaped like infants soaked in holy oil, and would place them on the laboring woman's chest, whispering that the spirits of other mothers watched over her. Pain, to them, was not a mere sensation, but a force, a living entity to be bargained with. They spoke to it, cursed it, commanded it to leave. Some burned feathers to choke it with smoke. Others drew crosses with salt water on the woman's forehead, muttering that the pain must now cross the threshold and depart. In these acts, faith and magic became indistinguishable, both born of the same human need to make meaning out of suffering. There were also darker remedies, spoken of only in secret. In the back rooms of apothecaries, certain powders were sold with no label, only a warning, not for use by Christians. These were mixtures of lead, mercury, and crushed stone, meant to cool the blood, but often poisoning it instead. Some midwives brewed these unknowingly, following recipes older than the church itself. A few were tried and executed when mothers died in agony. Yet others became legends, known as women who could summon birth from death itself. As the centuries turned, this dangerous knowledge spread through Europe's hidden corridors. Convents, monasteries, apothecaries, and the shadowed trade routes of the Mediterranean. Monks, though forbidden to treat women, recorded what they saw and heard. In the margins of theological texts, small notes appeared. A decoction of willow bark lessens the pain. Clove oil eases the fever. These scribbles were the first murmurs of science beneath the roar of theology. And yet, superstition remained stronger than reason. Many believed that childbirth pain came not from the body, but from the soul, that demons clung to the womb, whispering curses. To expel them, midwives performed elaborate rites. They burned wax effigies, recited the Magnificat backward, or placed iron shears beneath the bed to cut the invisible cords of evil. In France, some women were told to grasp a crucifix so tightly that their palms bled, to join their pain to that of Christ. Pain became a form of penance, but also of identity. To suffer well was to prove one's virtue. To seek relief was to risk being called unholy. And so, many women bore their agony in silence, gripping rosaries until the beads broke, their lips muttering between screams. Fiat voluntas tua. Thy will be done. There are accounts from noble households where the contrast between privilege and faith was stark. In the 15th century, noble women sometimes summoned physicians trained in the Salerno school, who brought with them instruments of silver and advice from Greek and Arab texts. They prescribed gentler measures, baths of warm water, compresses soaked in wine, diets rich in milk and sugar before birth. But even these learned men deferred to the Church's decree. No woman should be fully spared of pain, for in pain lay redemption. Thus, even queens screamed in chambers lined with velvet and gold, their cries echoing through corridors like prayers unanswered. The chroniclers often described the moment of crisis, when pain became unbearable, when reason fled. A midwife might lean close and whisper, "Hold on, child, the saints are near." Sometimes she lied, for she could see the shadow crossing the mother's face, the pallor of death already settling. If the woman died before the child emerged, a terrible ritual began. The body was cut open, not out of cruelty but of faith, to baptize the infant before its soul was lost. Priests argued endlessly about this practice, whether it defied or fulfilled God's will. But for the women who wielded the knives, it was an act of mercy, the last attempt to save at least one life from divine judgment. These rituals reveal a world where mercy and horror were indistinguishable. To the medieval mind, there was no contradiction in praying to the Virgin while smearing animal fat upon the belly, or in chanting psalms while administering wine laced with poison. The sacred and the profane lived in the same room, breathing the same air. In some rare manuscripts, preserved now in the dim archives of forgotten monasteries, there appear notes in women's own hands, unsigned but unmistakably personal. One writes, "We boiled the root in wine and prayed thrice. She slept for a time, then opened her eyes and said she had seen the angels. The child was born and lived." Another reads, "The pain took her mind before her body. She called for her mother, who was long dead. I said she would see her soon. I hope I did not lie." These fragments are the truest record of that age, not the sermons or the laws, but the trembling voices of those who lived between them. They show that medieval women, even under the weight of doctrine, were not passive victims of suffering. They experimented, they remembered, they whispered. Their knowledge was empirical, drawn from trial and tragedy. They were the first physicians of their own flesh. By the late 15th century, change crept in like dawn through a shuttered window. Scholars began to question whether suffering was indeed holy. Some whispered that God could not demand agony as proof of virtue. Others argued that if pain could be measured, perhaps it could be lessened, not by sin, but by skill. The Church resisted, but the tide had begun to turn. Still, for centuries, childbirth remained the most dangerous act a woman could undertake. Behind every royal birth announcement, every village christening, lay the silent statistics of death. 1 in 10 mothers gone, 1 in 4 children lost before their first breath. These numbers haunted every generation, a shadow cast upon the cradle. And yet, amid all this suffering, there persisted a strange reverence for the act itself. To give birth was to touch the divine, to bleed, to scream, to survive. Pain was not just endured, it was sanctified. It was the threshold between sin and grace, between flesh and eternity. As the candle in this imagined chamber gutters to its end, one might picture those rooms again, the scent of herbs and smoke, the cries that rose like psalms, the trembling hands that moved between life and death. Pain was their scripture, written in blood, and through that pain, they left a legacy that would outlast every superstition, every curse. The legacy of women who, in the darkest centuries, learned to heal with nothing but courage, faith, and fire. The pages that follow are darker still. The ink faded, the parchment stained as though touched by tears. The tone changes, as if the chronicler has grown weary of recording the same cries, the same endings. What began as an act of faith now drifts into judgment, fear, and superstition. This part of the record no longer concerns how women gave birth, but what happened when they did not survive it. For in the Middle Ages, death in childbirth was not only tragedy, it was theology. When a woman died upon the bed where she had labored, her death was rarely seen as an accident. It was a sign. The Church taught that all suffering bore divine purpose. Therefore, to die in childbirth was either a mark of sanctity or of sin. The difference was decided not by mercy, but by interpretation. The midwife who had stood by her through every moment of agony often became the first suspect. It was whispered that she had failed to pray correctly, or that she had used the wrong herbs, or worse, that she had made a pact with the devil to claim the woman's soul. In the flicker of candlelight, her hands, once praised for their steadiness, were now regarded as instruments of evil. And so, the same woman who brought life could be accused of bringing death. Records from inquisitorial trials describe midwives interrogated before priests and magistrates, their bags of herbs laid out like evidence of witchcraft. One was asked why she had tied a red ribbon around a woman's waist. "To ease her pain," she said. The court replied, "You sought to command God's will." Another was charged for whispering Latin phrases over a dying mother, words the court claimed were spells. She insisted they were prayers. The line between salvation and sorcery had grown perilously thin. When childbirth went wrong, fear consumed the household. The priest was summoned not as comfort, but as judge. His first duty was to ask, had the child been baptized? If the answer was no, a grim ritual began. The church taught that an unbaptized soul could not enter heaven, even if it had never breathed. To save it, priests devised a desperate solution: the baptismus in utero, baptism within the womb. A long, narrow funnel was inserted into the mother's body. Holy water poured through while prayers were recited. "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," the priest would murmur, as if the words could reach the child through layers of flesh and death. Sometimes the ritual was performed after the mother's passing, in the hope that the child still lived for a moment. To modern eyes, it is an act of horror. To them, it was mercy. The failure of birth brought shame not only to the dead woman, but to her family. In some places, a mother who died unshriven, without confession, was buried apart from the other women, her grave left unmarked. Superstitions grew around these deaths. It was said that women who died in childbirth might rise again at night, searching for the infants they had never held. Villagers left small bundles of cloth or milk at their graves to soothe their restless spirits. To prevent this haunting, some midwives performed secret rites before burial. They placed a candle between the woman's legs, saying it would guide her soul toward the light. Others cut the cord of the dead child from the mother's body and buried it separately, believing it bound the two in the next world. These acts were condemned as heresy, yet they persisted, born of compassion in a world that offered none. The Church's power over childbirth extended even into the grave. In its teachings, every death in labor was both moral lesson and warning. A priest might tell the village that the woman had been vain, that she had sinned by fearing the pain meant to purify her. If she had cried out against God during labor, her suffering was said to have been doubled by divine retribution. In such sermons, the dead were made examples, their agony transformed into doctrine. For the survivors, guilt became a kind of inheritance. Husbands blamed themselves for not praying enough, or for loving their wives too much and tempting divine jealousy. Some remarried quickly. Others withdrew in silence. Children who survived such births grew up believing their first breath had cost another life, a debt they could never repay. In convents, nuns recorded these stories with a mixture of sorrow and awe. They called the women who died martyrs of Eve, and sometimes painted them as saints in miniature manuscripts, a mother crowned with light, a child cradled in her arms, both rising toward heaven. Yet these images could not erase the darker truth, that most women died nameless, their bodies wrapped in linen and forgotten by winter's end. The midwives, too, bore the weight of these deaths. Their profession, once regarded with cautious respect, became a target of moral panic. The 15th and 16th centuries saw a rise in witch hunts across Europe, and midwives were among the first accused. Their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and childbirth made them both indispensable and suspect. "Only witches know the secrets of blood," one inquisitor wrote, "and blood calls to the devil." In many trials, a single failed birth was enough to condemn a woman. If a baby was stillborn, the midwife was said to have cursed it. If a mother died, she was accused of stealing her soul. Testimonies often mention herbs like belladonna or mandrake, the very same substances used to ease pain, cited as proof of witchcraft. "She boiled leaves in wine and spoke Latin words," one record reads. "The woman screamed and died, and so she is guilty." Yet beneath this terror, quiet acts of resistance continued. Some midwives fled to remote villages, living as outcasts but still tending to births in secret. Others disguised their remedies as prayers, hiding recipes inside psalm books. There are accounts of women smuggling forbidden herbs under the cover of pilgrimage, trading them as relics rather than medicine. Faith became their disguise, survival their heresy. The fear surrounding childbirth was not confined to the poor. In royal courts, the deaths of queens and noblewomen carried political consequences. When Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, died after giving birth in 1537, her passing was mourned as divine sacrifice, a queen's body offered for the birth of a king. Yet behind the public mourning, whispers blamed her physicians and attendants, accusing them of sin or incompetence. The same pattern repeated across Europe. Every failed birth demanded a scapegoat, but even when no accusation followed, the memory of death lingered. Women who survived childbirth were not always whole. Many suffered what the chronicles call the rupture of the body, injuries that never healed. Some were left incontinent, some barren, others haunted by fever that returned with every moon. Yet society called them blessed, for they had fulfilled their duty. To question the cost of survival was to question God Himself, and so silence became the law of women's pain. No one spoke of it openly, but it lived in their gestures, the way mothers touched their bellies, the way widowers avoided the sight of a birthing room, the way midwives washed their hands too long after every delivery. The body remembered what the Church preferred to forget. By the late Middle Ages, a few thinkers began to challenge this silence. Physicians influenced by the new humanist movement argued that childbirth should be studied, not sanctified. They dissected bodies in secret, trying to understand why so many women died. Their findings were crude, often censored, but revolutionary. They discovered infection, hemorrhage, obstruction. Natural causes, not divine punishment. Still, their words rarely reached the women who needed them most. For every scholar's revelation, 100 sermons reminded mothers that their agony was holy. Among the midwives, this shift created both hope and fear. Knowledge could save lives, but knowledge was also dangerous. A woman who read medical texts risked being called a witch. And so, many chose to keep their learning hidden, disguised as faith. Their prayers were manuals, their rosaries mnemonic devices for remembering the steps of a delivery. Beneath every Ave Maria, another truth was whispered, one about the body, not the soul. The birth chamber thus became a battlefield of belief. Each cry of pain was an act of theology, each death a sermon, each survivor a paradox, both blessed and broken. The midwife's room was a crucible where religion, superstition, and the first sparks of science collided. And amid the smoke and incense, humanity persisted. Hands that trembled but did not fail. Eyes that closed the dead. Voices that sang lullabies to infants who would never wake. Even in failure, there was ritual. When mother and child both died, their bodies were sometimes buried together. The baby placed upon the mother's breast, as if still nursing. In some regions, a small coin was placed in the infant's hand to pay its passage into the next world. The grave was sealed with salt and ash to ward off wandering spirits. These gestures, half pagan, half Christian, spoke of a truth older than any scripture, that grief needs ceremony, even when faith cannot explain it. In time, the Church softened its stance. By the 17th century, theologians began to speak of maternal death not as punishment, but as sacrifice. Yet by then, the old fear had already done its work. The image of the midwife as witch, of the mother as sinner, lingered like smoke over every birthbed. As the final lines of this chapter fade, the chronicler's hand seems to tremble. The words grow faint, but one sentence remains clear. A prayer, perhaps, or a lament. They bore life through blood, and we repaid them with silence. May the Lord forgive our blindness, for we mistook suffering for sanctity. And thus the record closes for the night. The candles gutter. The room grows dark. Yet outside, across centuries, the echoes of those cries remain. Not curses, not hymns, but the raw, unending sound of humanity, confronting the cost of life itself. The candle that has burned through this long, grim chronicle now flutters to its final inch of wick. What remains on the parchment is the quietest chapter, not of agony, but of awakening. It is the part of the story when the darkness of superstition, though not yet lifted, begins to crack along its edges. The tone of the ink changes, steadier again, written by someone who has seen death, but now dares to imagine knowledge as salvation. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe itself was transforming. War, plague, and famine had scarred the land, but in their aftermath, something extraordinary took root. Curiosity. The same impulse that once led monks to illuminate manuscripts with gold now led thinkers to open the human body and ask why it failed. For centuries, the Church had declared that the body was sacred, not to be dissected. But slowly, as the Renaissance dawned, the forbidden turned into inquiry. It began in the universities of Bologna, Padua, and Montpellier. Under vaulted ceilings and by torchlight, men who had studied Scripture now gathered around the bodies of the dead. Among them were the first physicians to map the womb, not as a symbol of sin, but as an organ, a structure of flesh and vessel and muscle. They traced veins with quills dipped in ink. They named the unseen. Their words were dry, clinical, and cold. Yet in them something revolutionary stirred. These were not women's voices, not yet. The female experience of childbirth still belonged to the realm of midwives and secrecy. But the language of medicine began to shift. In the old texts, pain was moral. In the new, it was physiological. This was the first fracture in the ancient belief that agony was holy. Pain became not punishment but a problem, one that could perhaps be solved. Still, the journey from theology to anatomy was neither quick nor kind. Midwives remained in peril. Their knowledge, though vast, lacked written form. They could describe a breech birth better than any physician, yet they had no Latin to defend their art in court. The universities, open only to men, built an empire of learning from the silent wisdom of women they never met. A cruel irony unfolded. What the church had once condemned as witchcraft, scholars now rediscovered and called science. Yet even in this theft, progress emerged. In the 16th century, manuals of midwifery began to circulate, some written by physicians, others translated from older vernacular guides. They were filled with diagrams of the uterus, drawings of the fetus, and instructions for delivery. The tone was often condescending, describing women as weaker vessels. Yet the intent had changed, to understand, not to punish. Among these early texts was a rediscovery of Greek medical thought. Galen, Hippocrates, and Soranus of Ephesus. Voices from antiquity that treated childbirth as craft, not curse. But not everyone welcomed this change. Many clergy warned that human dissection and medical interference were acts of blasphemy. To them, childbirth remained sacred territory, the realm of divine mystery. When early physicians proposed methods to ease pain, through herbal sedatives, controlled breathing, or careful positioning, they were accused of undermining God's decree. The old sermon still thundered, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." And so the war between faith and flesh continued, one cradle at a time. In this divided world, women themselves began to record their stories. Within convents, literate nuns who had long tended the sick started to write not prayers, but observations. Their notebooks, bound in leather and kept hidden from their confessors, described the practical realities of childbirth. The temperatures of fever, the smell of infection, the time between contractions. These writings were not theology, they were data. One can almost see the shift happening within the ink itself. Devotion turning to documentation. Outside the cloisters, a few women began to claim the forbidden title of physician. In the German states, a midwife named Jokaria Witz wrote, Der schwangeren Frauen und Hebammen Rosengarten, the Rose Garden for Pregnant Women and Midwives, in 1513. It was a bold act, a woman putting her knowledge into print under her own name. Her work combined herbal remedies, observations of anatomy, and religious faith, bridging the gap between superstition and science. Though derided by male scholars, it spread across Europe, copied by hand, whispered from one healer to another. From Italy came another voice, Trocula of Salerno, whose teachings, though older by centuries, resurfaced during this time. Her writings on women's health were republished by scholars who often claimed them as their own, yet her words endured, offering practical, compassionate advice on pregnancy, hygiene, and recovery, a rare glimpse of empathy in a field long governed by fear. The 17th century brought with it a new kind of daring, the idea that childbirth pain could and should be relieved. The moral order trembled. For generations, priests had preached that to numb a woman's pain was to defy divine justice. But as the Renaissance gave way to reason, that argument began to falter. If God gave man the gift of understanding, wrote one physician, Is it not sin to leave pain unchallenged? And so began the earliest experiments in obstetric anesthesia, crude, uncertain, and often deadly. Herbal infusions were replaced by distillations of alcohol and ether. Physicians tested them on themselves, then on laboring women. Some mixtures sent both mother and child into eternal sleep. Others worked, miraculously, and were denounced from the pulpit the next Sunday. The moral war over pain intensified, one side calling it divine order, the other calling it needless cruelty. But while men debated in lecture halls, women continued to give birth in silence. The midwife still held her place beside the bed, though now she was joined, or replaced, by male surgeons. The birthing chamber, once an all-female sanctuary, became an arena of masculine authority. Instruments multiplied. Hooks, forceps, clamps. Knowledge advanced, but tenderness waned. Women were studied, not understood. Still, change, once begun, could not be reversed. The idea that pain could be studied opened a door that would never again be shut. The birthbed became not a confessional, but a laboratory. Cleanliness replaced incantation. Anatomy replaced prayer. Slowly, the fatal numbers began to fall. More mothers lived. More children breathed. Yet even as medicine triumphed, something sacred was lost. The communion of women, the rituals of care that had bound generations together. The midwife's whispered prayers, the burning herbs, the hands clasped in faith, these faded into memory, dismissed as superstition. What had once been the collective wisdom of women became folklore, while the men who studied their art were praised as founders of modern obstetrics. But the memory of those women, the midwives, the mothers, the witnesses, did not vanish entirely. Their spirit lingered in the shadows of the hospitals that replaced their cottages. Their methods, stripped of ritual but not of essence, survived in every act of compassion, in every hand that soothed rather than cut. By the Enlightenment, when reason reigned supreme, it seemed the age of superstition had finally ended. Pain was measured, charted, explained. Yet even then, moral debate persisted. When Queen Victoria gave birth to Prince Leopold in 1853 under chloroform anesthesia, churchmen still called it a sin. To flee the pain of Eve, they said, is to defy God. But the Queen's serene survival silenced them more effectively than any sermon. From that moment, the dogma of divine suffering began to crumble. Looking backward from this point, the centuries of agony appear almost mythic. Too cruel, too senseless to have been real. And yet they were. For more than 1,000 years, women bore the weight of theology upon their flesh. They died in faith, in fear, in silence, and in blood. But through them humanity learned. Each death was a lesson written in invisible ink, read only centuries later by those who finally dared to ask why. The legacy of that long darkness still haunts the modern world. Every sterile delivery room, every soft cry of a newborn, every antiseptic scent is built upon the bones of those forgotten mothers. Their suffering gave birth not only to children, but to medicine itself. Without their agony, there would be no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no science of life. And perhaps that is the paradox that history can never resolve, that knowledge was born from pain, and that the same world that condemned women's bodies for sin would one day study them to save all others. The line between punishment and progress runs straight through the history of childbirth, a scar across civilization's memory. Now, as the final page curls beneath the candle's last light, the chronicler writes one closing passage, neither prayer nor lament, but testament. They entered the world through agony and brought the world with them. Their blood was the ink that wrote our science, their cries the rhythm of our faith. We build hospitals upon the ground they sanctified with their suffering, and we call it progress. But in the silence that follows every birth, if one listens closely, one may still hear them. The breath of those who crossed the border between life and death, so that others might never have to. The candle dies, the parchment cools, and in the darkness that follows, history itself exhales, as if, at last, after centuries of pain and silence, it too can finally rest. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.